Joining me right now here on Live Your True Life Perspectives, Dan Nelson. Dan is a genealogist. He's our genealogist, our historian for Live Your True Life Perspectives. He has DanCestersGenealogy.com. You can check it out. Dan Cesters, it's D-A-N, Dan like ancestors. DanCestersGenealogy.com. And it's really great because he actually goes back and checks out your entire family history, your entire family tree. You can learn a lot about yourself. You can learn a lot about your family. And I think one of the things is that we all kind of want this information, but you know how hard and tedious it is to get all that stuff together? And Dan actually puts that together in an amazing, like, old school leather book that you can have and you can give from generation to generation. Dan, great to have you live on Live Your True Life Perspectives. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Good afternoon, Ashley. Glad to be here.
Well, I'm glad to have you. And, you know, history does repeat itself. And you have a very interesting historical story for us about a family heirloom that actually involves the Continental Congress and the assassination of President Lincoln. How does that happen?
Well, it is quite a range of times between those two events. But, yeah, this family heirloom sort of traveled between those two time frames and is still part of the world today. So, yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that. Hopefully, sometimes going back in the past in history could be comforting versus, you know, being the constant news feed we have today. So this story is in my own family, and it involves back in 2010, I found out that my great-grandmother's 98-year-old cousin, Virginia Smither, was still alive in Enid, Oklahoma. And, of course, what was amazing to me is my great-grandmother had passed away some 40 years ago at the age of 91. So you don't think of somebody that passed away 40 years ago at age 91 still having a cousin here on Earth. But it turns out she was still alive, and our common ancestor was my great-great-great-grandfather, William Hoppa Smither. I'll use a little Mississippi accent here, but he had 14 children by 3 different wives, and William Hoppa Smither was a prosperous planter, merchant, judge, and citizen of Oxford, Mississippi. So that's all the northern Mississippi accent attempt you're going to get from me, but we'll talk about him in future sessions. So in 2011, I visited Virginia there in Enid, and she shared with me this fascinating story of a silver teapot that had been handed down from her grandmother Smither's side of the family to the youngest granddaughter of each generation. So Virginia was the youngest granddaughter of William Harper Smither, and she since passed it on to her great-granddaughter, Emily, who lives there in Enid. So this silver teapot has traveled through many youngest granddaughters. Virginia passed away in 2012 at age 100, but the legacy continues. So what she told me about this silver teapot, because it's one thing to have something get passed down in your family, but she said it was used in Independence Hall in Philadelphia while the Continental Congress was in session. Wow. And it had belonged to the Thompson family. And we'll talk more about the Thompson family in later segments, but I thought it was sort of interesting. You know, I'd really never given it thought before this, that there was a silver teapot in Independence Hall, because if you put on your U.S. history hat and think back to the Boston Tea Party. Well, with the Boston Tea Party, we rejected tea as a symbol of British suppression, taxes, culture. I mean, drinking tea was, you know, borderline treasonous at that point. And you know, you were just talking about earlier how things suddenly changed. Well, suddenly being a colonial American, tea, which was your favorite beverage, was no longer allowed to be your favorite beverage. So think about whatever yours might be today, losing that. So what they did, because, of course, they couldn't just switch to alcoholic drinks, that'd be sober occasionally, they switched to coffee and chocolate. And just before the Revolution, just to give you an idea, 2 million pounds of cocoa were imported into New England. So what about a couple of the founding fathers? So you had Thomas Jefferson. He is quoted as saying, "By getting chocolate good in quality and cheap in price, the superiority of the article, both for health and nourishment, will soon give it the same preference over tea and coffee in America, which it has in Spain." So apparently Spain had already gone through this. They were probably in a war with Britain at the time or whatever. So, okay, we know Thomas Jefferson was on Team Chocolate, but what about John Adams? Well, he fell under the spell of coffee, and he wrote a letter to his wife. "Madam," said I to Mrs. Houston, "is it lawful for a weary traveler to refresh himself with a dish of tea provided has been honestly smuggled or paid no duties? And she responded, "No, sir," said she. "We have all renounced all tea in this place. I can't make tea, but I will make you coffee. Accordingly, I have drank coffee every afternoon since and have borne it very well. Tea must be universally renounced. I must be weaned, and the sooner the better." So that's the story about a couple of future U.S. presidents got off of the tea fix and switched over to coffee and chocolate.
Well, I definitely like coffee. I mean, I'm a tea person, but I actually prefer coffee and chocolate, so I'm not sure if it was a bad thing.
Yeah, well, now you know how coffee became so popular and chocolate behind it. If it hadn't been for, I guess if the British had said, "Hey, we're not going to tax the tea, it's cool, you need some extra," we'd all still be drinking tea. But after the next thing I went and did is I sort of thought, well, let me see if I can find evidence of this silver teapot in the Independence Hall. So you go and look at all the paintings that were done of the Continental Congress in session, and it had been so great if there had been a silver teapot, sitting on Ben Franklin's desk, and he's pouring tea into, Thomas Jefferson's cup. But no such picture. So I reached out to the curators at Independence Hall. Figured they'd know of anybody. So their response was, there's not a teapot in the assembly room today, but they do have one in the governor's council chamber. And they said that actually there would have been no refreshments allowed in the assembly room at the time. That would have been highly inappropriate. It was a formal session. Those sessions were usually short, but they would have broken out to separate rooms to do the work, which was mostly done in committee, and certainly those rooms had refreshments, including the governor's council chamber, which had the silver teapot. So if somehow in your head you thought there was a Coke machine in the lobby of Independence Hall, no, there was not. So, it's interesting how you tie this to recent times, because we all, until the coronavirus showed up, we were all talking about impeachment, and during those episodes, they were saying how they weren't serving refreshments to the senators, and they were saying that that's why some of the senators were sleepyheads. So I guess, things don't change that much. So just to finish up a little bit more here on the investigation, my second cousin Amy, she tracked down the meanings of the markings on the silver, and the markings indicated that it was sterling silver imported from London, and that it was manufactured in Newcastle, England, between 1770 and 1771. And we know, because there was no duty stamp, it was brought to America before 1790. So the time frame of the silver perfectly matches the time frame of the meeting of the Continental Congress at Independence Hall. So we're still on track with this story potentially being a true story. So in the next segment, I'm going to talk about what we found out about the Thompson family that owned this silver teapot and passed it into my Smither family.
Well, I look forward to hearing more about that. This is very interesting. So I look forward. I can't wait to have you back next week so we can talk about that. It's so cool that this has actually gone through all that time and it has actually been through all that historical importance.
Yeah, it is amazing, and it's a fascinating story, and there's even better stuff in future segments, so something to look forward to.
Well, I can't wait. We'll definitely see you next week, and you can go to dancestorsgenealogy.com and learn more about Dan.